He has mentioned all of those things, but essentially the whole verdict was about those days during the protests, the crackdown on the protests. Is there going to be any recourse about what's been done over the 30 years of Mubarak's rule, the injustices that many people see or they would rather have upheld rather than just focusing on those few days of protests?
Yeah, I mean, the 30 years of abuses, that's still the big question here, and there's no sign that I've seen yet that anyone is really willing to have a real effort at fact-finding of truth and reconciliation. That would require a massive national project, and there's no sign that that's a direction that the current military council is willing to go. If Ahmed Shafiq wins the presidency, then forget about it, because looking back at the past 30 years would inevitably implicate him, right? And even the Muslim Brotherhood candidate hasn't made this a key part of his political campaign. I think there's a sense that they don't want to get stuck in that, because that means confronting the old elements of the old regime. It means confronting the ruling military council. And there are a lot of Egyptians that want to kind of look to the future and see tangible changes in their daily lives. So I don't think there are a lot of politicians in Egypt now that have the courage to really open that file. 30 years of anger, frustration, injustice, that takes strong political leadership. And unfortunately, up until now, we don't really have that.
But should we really belittle the changes we've seen? As we said, it was 30 years with one leader, and within a year, there have been elections, there have been, sentencing of former leaders. Isn't this how democracy progresses? It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, we shouldn't underestimate what has happened here. Anyone who says Egypt has not changed is wrong. Egypt has changed. It hasn't changed enough, of course, but we do see elections. We do see an election where people don't know who's going to win. So the first time you have that uncertainty. So things are very much in flux.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second because we just need to mark the top of the hour. It's 9 GMT. That's 11 a.m. in Cairo. You're watching Al Jazeera's extended coverage of the trial of Hosni Mubarak. I'm Divya Gopalan. Let me take you through what's been happening. Egypt's former president has been sentenced to life for complicity in the killing of hundreds of protesters during last year's uprising.
Defendant Mohammed Hosni Mubarak be sentenced to a life term for the accusation ascribed to him.
And just after that verdict was read out, there were scenes of jubilation outside the court as some celebrate the news of Mubarak's life sentence. But the courtroom erupts inside the court in anger after his sons are acquitted of corruption charges. Let's now take a closer look at the verdict and its implications. Mubarak has been sentenced to life in prison for his role in killing of hundreds of protesters during the revolution that toppled him last year. But he was acquitted on charges of corruption along with his two sons. The former Interior Minister, Habib al-Adli, was given a life sentence for ordering security forces to open fire on protesters. 6 of his aides were also on trial, but they were acquitted on all charges, including corruption and conspiring to kill protesters. So now let's take a look at the dramatic announcement in court that was set out just a while ago.
The defendant Mohammed Hosni Mubarak be sentenced to a life term for the accusation ascribed to him being accessory to the murder accompanied by attempt murder as ascribed to him in the bill of indictment.
Okay, we can go now live to Shireen Tadros, who's standing by for us outside of the court. Shireen, not long ago there was some huge reaction to what was being said in court. Tell us what the scene there is like now.
A lot calmer, although, as you saw just a moment ago, there was euphoria at one point, people firing fireworks up into the air. I think as people actually read the ins and outs of this verdict and it all settles down, we might actually see a different reaction, because a lot of people are now talking about how easy it will be to appeal these life sentences, because at the end of the day, it looks more like a political decision than one based on legal merit. The fact that you had these senior aides that were on trial, the aides from the Interior Ministry acquitted, means that the actual link of ordering to kill, giving those orders to kill to the police officers to kill the protesters, that actually was not found. There was insufficient evidence to prove that. So it's almost as if the interpretation, at least, is that Habib al-Adli and Hosni Mubarak are actually being sentenced because of their political responsibility. The fact that as head of state and as the Interior Minister, head of the police and security services, they were in a position to stop the killings rather than they actually gave the orders. And that, of course, leaves a lot of room open for an appeal. And of course, this is the maximum sentence that can be given. If there's an appeal after that, there can't be more of a higher sentence. There can't be a death penalty imposed. Of course, other questions too as to why Gamal and Ala, Hosni Mubarak's sons, were acquitted, and why nobody thought beforehand that these charges were actually outside of the statute of limitations and outside the time period for which they can have a conviction. A lot of questions still, people really trying to digest all of these different verdicts.
That's right, Shireen. And give us an idea of the security situation there.
Well, just behind me here, thousands of riot police, soldiers, tens of armored personnel carriers, APC stationed outside the police academy. We had a bit of trouble about 15 or 20 minutes ago when we were live on air, when you could see that some people were trying to break the cordon and the riot police were pushing them back. Now, behind what you can see behind me is in fact other protesters. Those are pro-Mubarak protesters. There's only about 20 or 30 of them, but they, when they heard the verdict, erupted as well, very upset, very angry, and they also had a few scuffles with the police and security forces. A lot of the roads leading to this area, the police academy, have been closed. There was certainly an expectation, given how politically charged the atmosphere here is right now in Egypt, that there would be trouble. So certainly the country is still very much on edge.
That's Shireen Tadros, just outside of the courthouse, which is on the outskirts of Cairo at the police academy. That's where the proceedings have been taking place. We can now go to Tahrir Square, where our correspondent Mike Hanna is standing by. And just to remind our viewers, Tahrir Square is ground zero for the protests, where most of the protests took place and most of the events took place, the events that Hosni Mubarak has stood trial for. Mike Hanna, what's been the reaction there so far?
Well, the square behind is fairly empty at the moment, but that is going to change in the course of the day. Already people are starting to gather, chanting, "Batal, Batal, invalid, invalid." The news of the judgment greeted with cheers when those in the vicinity here heard that Hosni Mubarak and his Interior Minister had been sentenced to life. But now a degree of confusion creeping in as they realize that a number of charges have been dropped against the others, including the Mubarak sons, and importantly, that the judge found no responsibility for the police forces during that uprising. No responsibility, direct responsibility, for the hundreds of people who were killed. Hosni Mubarak and his Interior Minister have not been found guilty of doing something. They have been found guilty of not doing something. This is a very critical difference. Important to realize, too, the judge making clear that his statement was handwritten. In other words, it's going to take a period of time before the typewritten statement is handed out, made public. The question is as well that many are asking, what in the 100 days when the trial was adjourned to the day of judgment was the judge and his assistants in fact doing if they did not come to this final hearing with a typewritten statement that they were relying on one written by hand? Many questions here, and people beginning to gather in Tahrir Square to ask more.
And indeed, Mike, maybe one of the biggest questions would be, what about what's happened during the regime of Hosni Mubarak? Now, the judge interestingly outlined the events leading to this point. He called it 30 years of black oppression, but it doesn't seem like any of that was addressed during the hearing.
Well, indeed, no. The judge had made very clear that with relation to the charges involving murder, These were directly related to the period of that uprising from January through February. That was always very clear in the charge sheet. That is what the prosecutors had made clear. That is what the judge had made clear. However, those corruption charges which involved the sale of villas in Sharm el-Sheikh, they had been around for a long time. The Interior Minister had been standing trial before the Mubarak trial began for those events. For the judge to suddenly announce that there was a statute of limitations concerning those corruption charges, another question that many are going to have. Why, throughout the period of the trial, did the prosecution or the defense not directly refer to the fact that there was a statute of limitations concerning corruption charges? So the whole issue of what happened during 3 decades of rule, the alleged corruption, remains precisely that. It is alleged corruption. Egypt's court has now found that it cannot rule on those events because it is outside the time limit imposed for such events, so that remains open. Maybe other trials will begin, we do not know. But at this particular stage, Hosni Mubarak and his Interior Minister have been held accountable only for not doing something during the revolution. They are not being held into account for the decades that led to that revolution, and they are not being held directly responsible for the deaths of the hundreds during the period of that uprising.
Now, Mike, Tahrir Square was where it all started, and it is a historical location now, especially with regards to this trial. But the issue at hand is what most of the people had come to Tahrir Square for has not been addressed during this trial. Do you think there's appetite for more protest or appetite for people coming back to the street to demand change still? Or does it feel like they've tried their hardest and this is another chapter closed in the history books?
Well, one senses a sense of deep frustration emerging slowly as the details of this judgment begin to seep home. Great jubilation at the moment that Hosni Mubarak and his Interior Minister were given life sentences. But as I said, a degree of confusion turning into a degree of anger is now emerging. There are people beginning to come to the square. The question of whether there are likely to be countrywide protests, well, that is something that will develop as the day goes on. However, there will be stepped-up security at the Interior Ministry, which is just up the road, which has been a particular focus of the anger of protesters in the past. The fact that nobody in that ministry has been held responsible for the killings of hundreds of people is something that is likely to weigh heavily on those who've been in Tahrir Square before, on those who've marched on that Interior Ministry building. These are types of targets that one may see in the days ahead, bearing in mind, too, that an election campaign is underway, the second round of a presidential election about to happen. One of those candidates standing, Ahmed Shafiq, the last Prime Minister of Hosni Mubarak. There is the possibility that the anger of those feeling sold short by this judgment may be directed towards that candidate in the course of the vote. There are many ramifications that are going to arise out of what, in the Egyptian popular eye, is likely to be an exceedingly controversial, deeply unpopular judgment that actually has left more questions unanswered than it addressed in the case itself.
That's Mike Hanna live for us in Tahrir Square, and I want to stress to our viewers that Tahrir Square is where the protests had started, and this is where basically this spot was where people had gathered to topple Hosni Mubarak, who then faced the courts over his actions and was handed down a life sentence. Another place where protests were taking place and they spread from Tahrir Square was over to was over to Alexandria, where our correspondent Jamal El-Shail is standing by for us. Jamal El-Shail, tell us what the reaction there has been.
Well, Divya, I'll tell you, I'm here in Alexandria. It's Egypt's second largest city. Right behind me, the streets right behind me witnessed several people being killed during that revolution. This area here outside Qa'id Ibrahim Mosque was the Alexandrian version of Tahrir Square, as there was a version in every city across Egypt. The people here, many of them staying at home to watch the verdict. Several who were walking by, as we asked them, there is strong dissatisfaction towards that verdict. And the idea is, how or who is it that gave the orders for people like those who were killed in Alexandria to be killed? If up until today's trial, every single police officer who was charged with killing a protester was acquitted. Now their superiors in the Interior Ministry were also acquitted. Also the minister, also the president acquitted of giving orders to kill. The question is, as Mike was saying, that is yet to be answered, is who gave those orders? And there are several families of those killed, and I've been speaking to them, those killed in the revolution who were looking for a much stronger sentence. In fact, one of them who I spoke to said that he wanted, him and his wife, they had lost their 16-year-old son. They wanted Mubarak to see, Mubarak rather executed 100 times. It's still early hours here in the day. However, there is an expectation that there could very well be a large number of people coming out. The next few hours are going to be critical in order to see how people will react. But early indications in terms of the expectations of the people have, particularly considering that when you're acquitting people like Gamal Mubarak, Mubarak's son, Ala Mubarak, and the senior people, including the head of Egypt's Central Security Agency, one of the most notorious security elements of the former regime, acquitting these people, putting them free in an Egypt where one of the front runners for the next presidency is the last prime minister to serve under Mubarak, the prime minister who was serving as people were killed in the middle of the day in Tahrir Square during what was known as the Camel incident, that they could possibly team up and bring back those old days. So there's a lot of anger as well as fear as to what the coming days, or in fact coming hours, could hold.
Indeed. And Jamal, I want to throw it forward to the runoff elections that are due to take place. Given this verdict now, and Mubarak's former prime minister could be the next president, how do you think people are going to take it over there? How do you think they're going to view this runoff election given this verdict?
Well, based on Alexandria's history, long history of anti-Mubarak activism, based on the fact that you have opposition groups like Al-Karama, the socialists, like Kifaya, which was the Enough movement against Mubarak, and obviously the Muslim Brotherhood having a strong presence here in Alexandria. And based on the first round results of the presidential elections here in Alexandria, where remnants of the old regime like Ahmed Shafiq came 5th place, it's likely here in Alexandria that this will actually buoy them on even more to bring more support for the other candidate, Mohamed Morsi. Not necessarily because they may be supporting him, but more so because they are angered and will want to finally put to bed those remnants of the regime. It's difficult to sometimes predict these things because a lot of the time, particularly in Egyptian psyche, things here are taken based on emotion, and voters across the world, obviously, a lot of them have a short memory in terms that elections usually, or more often than not, are decided in the last few days up to before polling day. However, if we're to take a litmus test from the sentiment that's going to be felt by those here, then definitely will maybe fall more in favor of the person running against Shafiq than it is in favor of someone like Shafiq, who many will question, well, if Mubarak failed to stop the killing, and that's why he's being convicted, well, surely the prime minister should also be convicted because he also failed to stop the killing. So why is Mubarak and the interior minister going to jail and not the prime minister? And the prime minister, in fact, could very well lead the country as the next president.
Indeed, Jamal, so many questions left unanswered with this verdict. Thank you very much, Jamal El-Shail, there for us in Alexandria, keeping an eye on the situation there. Now, we can go back to the scene outside of the courtroom. These are live pictures from the outskirts of Cairo at the police academy where that verdict was handed down. Just to remind our viewers, Hosni Mubarak, one of the first Arab leaders, a victim of the Arab Spring, to be facing court with his own people. A verdict was handed down to him for a life sentence for what happened during those protests. Up to more than 800 protesters were killed during those protests. Many say in a brutal crackdown on them. Hosni Mubarak stood trial along with his interior minister. His sons also stood trial on corruption charges. Several aides and other ministers stood trial also for failing to protect property, is what they were standing trial for. Hosni Mubarak was handed a life sentence. Al-Adli, the interior minister, was handed a life sentence also, but Mubarak's sons were acquitted on the charges, and so were the aides and the other ministers who were also standing trial. Now, these sentences, of course, handed down not that long ago, elicited a huge response both inside and outside the courtroom. Outside the courtroom, there was jubilation to begin with, and then some scuffles. Later on, inside the courtroom, after the sons of Hosni Mubarak's verdict was handed down, saying that they were going to be acquitted on corruption charges, much dissatisfaction there and further scuffles inside the courtroom. Now, this, of course, was the verdict on the trial of Hosni Mubarak, his interior minister, several aides and his sons. We can now come back to the studio here and discuss what's happened further. We saw all kinds of reactions there, with people eliciting anger, although some have said a life sentence is the maximum that can happen. Was there ever any chance of a death penalty being handed down, in your opinion?
I don't think that was a realistic option. That would have been a bit too polarizing. As much as people dislike Mubarak, I think the idea of killing a former president wouldn't seem appropriate to many people. So I think this is really the best we could have expected for Mubarak himself. And as we've been saying, that's not where the problem is. The problem among many Egyptians is going to be what happened to other members of the regime, many of whom were acquitted today.
I just want to introduce you to our viewers there. This is Shadi Hamid, Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center. Thank you very much for being here with us to discuss this historic day where Hosni Mubarak has faced sentencing, is given a life sentence, but given his age, given his state of health, he had to be brought in by helicopter and a stretcher. How is this life sentence going to be carried out?
Well, his final years will be comfortable. I mean, he's going to have good medical services, I mean, as is to be expected in this kind of situation. But it is still a life sentence. And I think the issue of conditions is a little bit secondary to that. I mean, presumably some people want him to be punished and kind of suffer the pain that he inflicted on other Egyptians, but that's not going to happen, and that's not really the way the legal system works. But I think we still have to remember, though, that there is still a chance for appeal. This is not final or definitive. There could be a retrial. So, yes, it seems...
What could push this retrial? What could make this retrial happen?
Well, it's just a function of the appeals process and the fact that there were a lot of problems with how the trial was conducted, as your other guests have mentioned earlier. There are always these kinds of technicalities, and the appeals process in Egypt can be quite convoluted.
I'd like to point out the fact that, as you say, many people say that their grievances have not been addressed, and especially for those who had grievances during the 30 years that Mubarak ruled. And these were the people that went to Tahrir Square, went to protest, and eventually toppled him. Their grievances were never addressed. What was addressed was the fact that the protesters were killed, many people were injured, and it wasn't even him directly being accused of that. So what kind of justice has been served in all of this?
I mean, not a whole lot. No one has taken full responsibility for the killings that took place in Tahrir Square during the 18-day uprising. And again, it's worth emphasizing over and over that Mubarak has not been convicted for ordering the killing of protesters. He's been convicted effectively for not stopping the killings. And that is, I think, a very important distinction to make. The ones who actually oversaw the killings in the Ministry of Interior, many of them are still actually in that ministry working every day, which is remarkable, but that's the way it's turned out. So in that sense, there was a revolution. Some of the top figures have been put to prison, but a lot of the mid-ranking and upper mid-ranking officials who were the core of that regime are still working and living freely in Egypt.
Now, as you're speaking there, these are live pictures of Tahrir Square, and we just want to emphasize this is where the revolution began. This is where people first started gathering, and which eventually led to the end of Hosni Mubarak's regime. Now, one of the reasons they were on that street was because of corruption. Hosni Mubarak's regime was riddled with corruption, and there were all kinds of charges against him. But it seems that anything to do with corruption or any monetary issues were thrown out of court today, with both of Mubarak's sons being acquitted.
Well, the problem, fighting corruption in Egypt, even today, after the revolution, is going to be difficult because the military in Egypt controls a big chunk of the economy. I mean, analysts will say between 20% and 40% is either indirectly or directly controlled by the military and its various institutional structures. So once you start getting into the corruption file, then inevitably that's going to implicate some people in the military structure. And that's certainly something that the military doesn't want, it isn't ready for. And there are probably a lot of Egyptians who don't want that full-on confrontation. And that's why even Egypt's revolutionary politicians have been very careful about how they deal with this issue of the military's economic enterprises.
Shadi Hamid, it was good to speak to you. Stay with us. We'll probably be coming back to you. But I believe we can now go live to Shireen Tadros, who is standing by for us outside of the court. Shireen, you've been gauging reaction there so far. It started with an enormous reaction, an outburst, if you will. What is it like there now?
Well, the euphoria has certainly died down, and people are now starting to ask questions as to what this verdict actually means. It's starting to sink in that the prosecution failed to actually prove once and for all to the judges that orders were in fact given to kill protesters by the defendants. What seems to have emerged is the fact that the two big responsibility, if you like, lies with Hosni Mubarak, the former president, and Habib al-Adli, the former interior minister, because they held these high positions during the time of the uprising. And so they are politically responsible, not necessarily for actually ordering the killing, but responsible for not stopping the killings once they started. So it's not so much that they found, if you like, the smoking gun, insofar as there is a political decision that was made by those in charge. And what that actually means at the end of the day is that it's much easier, according to lawyers we've spoken to appeal this decision. The talk then is that this was a decision that was made by the judges in order to calm the situation down in a very politically charged atmosphere in Egypt, to make sure that the next round of presidential elections happen on time. And then after that, these decisions could well be appealed and the sentences be taken down.
Shireen, what are the scenarios being talked about now that this verdict has been handed down? Does it seem like people have the appetite to go back on the streets?
Well, we have to remember that it really just happened, and people are still watching their television screens, listening on the radio and talking to other people about what exactly it means. And everyone's aware that this is a long process. There's still possibly 2 rounds of appeals to go, and there are still other trials pending. Habib al-Adli has another trial pending, and also Gamal and Ala Mubarak have, the sons of Hosni Mubarak, have another trial pending, which was announced 2 days ago, to do with insider trading. So there is a lot of anger right now towards the fact that the Mubarak sons have been acquitted. A lot of people saying, does that mean that they walk free? It's unlikely, because the prosecution will almost certainly be appealing this decision to acquit Ala and Gamal. And also they have another trial pending. Now, the other defendants in that trial are actually free. They haven't been brought in yet. They're not detained. However, because the prosecution is likely to appeal this decision, I don't think we're going to see Gamal and Ala walk free today. I think they will be incarcerated until the next trial starts.
But what is clear is that Hosni Mubarak will be facing a life sentence. Are you getting any sense of how this is going to be carried out and where?
That's a big question, actually, and it's been a big question for weeks now, because the Egyptian people have been watching on their television screens, especially recently in the last few days, the whole notion of where exactly Hosni Mubarak is serving his sentence right now, where he was waiting for his trial. He was waiting for it inside the International Medical Center, a military hospital on the outskirts of Cairo, and it's said to, or it's reported to have been a very comfortable place where he enjoyed a garden, a swimming pool, and so on. These are all reports from hospital sources. So people want to see Hosni Mubarak serve his sentence not in that medical facility, but in fact in prison, or at the very least inside a hospital prison attached to Torah prison in Cairo.
Serena, as you're speaking there, we're looking at pictures of riot police. There was a little gathering there, maybe a little scuffle. They seem to have dispersed that. Tell us about the security situation and how on edge the government is right now.
Yeah, there have been sporadic scuffles here, both on this side of the cordon and also on the other side of the cordon, where, of course, we saw about 20 or 30 pro-Mubarak supporters gathering for the verdict. There are thousands of police officers, soldiers, armored personnel carriers, and so on in the vicinity of the police academy. And we're just panning now to show you a little bit of commotion that's happening. You can see the riot police now out on the street. They're calling for the ambulances to be redeployed, perhaps because there's some trouble further down the street. I can't see from my vantage point over here, but everyone seems to be running all over the place. It's a pretty chaotic scene. Having said that, you've got to remember that there are these sort of 5,000 at least security personnel stationed in and around this area, so there is a heavy security presence. They are trying to make sure that people calm down, and at the end of the day, it does look like they are certainly in the majority here. We're talking about sort of 200 or so protesters. We can see now, hopefully the camera is zooming in right there, riot police trying to apprehend some of the protesters throwing everything they can at them, from rocks to bottles and so on. The police going back to their lines and then going further towards them. It's a very similar scene to what we saw on the first session, the opening session, when there were these kinds of scuffles. It just shows you really how divisive, how polarized the country is now, and also how divisive the verdict is in this country. And now we can see even more people. I'm just going to get the camera to pan even more, because you'll be able to see that the police and the riot police are actually en masse going towards the protesters, chasing them down the street and out of the vicinity of the police academy. So a lot of them have actually moved from the door of the police academy, and they're now just really just chasing them down as far as possible to make sure that they don't come back to where the doors of the police academy are. And of course, inside the police academy is the hall where the trial has been taking place and where the verdicts were just announced.
Indeed, I want to underline what you've been talking about, Shireen, that this is the security situation just outside of the police academy, where the verdict has been handed down on the fate of the former president, Hosni Mubarak. There have been scuffles, riot police running back and forth, some going back to formation and then running to certain areas where it seems to be some minor trouble hotspots. And as Shireen has been saying, this has been happening on and off. Now, this is outside the police academy. That was the courtroom where Hosni Mubarak was sentenced. The former president was sentenced to life in prison after convicting him of involvement in the murder of protesters during the uprising that ousted him last year. Also, a life term was given for the killings was Mubarak's former interior minister, Habib al-Adli, while 6 other former police commanders were acquitted, and corruption charges against Mubarak's son, Ala and Gamal, were also dropped. Shireen, observers say that the trial has been conducted relatively fairly, but much of the evidence has been thrown out. Many of the witnesses weren't spoken to. Can you tell us about the many holes in the trial that has eventually led to this verdict and that people are concerned about?
Well, you know, the prosecution themselves admitted right at the end of when they were giving their final statements that actually they had a lot of problems in terms of the evidence that they had asked the various ministries, including the Interior Ministry and also the intelligence services for. They weren't getting the kind of cooperation they wanted, and that really hindered their case. And it's something that Judge Ahmed Rifat also alluded to when he was talking about the witnesses giving false testimonies during the trial, which led on the 2nd of January to Ahmed Rifat actually saying, that's it, enough witnesses, enough evidence heard, we're actually going to skip now to the closing arguments, much to the dismay of both the prosecution and in fact the defense, who at the time said that they had more witnesses and evidence that they wanted to get from the various ministries and wanted to present to the judges. So there's been a lot of holes, a lot of questions surrounding the trial. The larger question and issue was over the fact that you had these different ranking people some of them very senior, some of them less senior, facing trial at the same time, and also these different charges from financial corruption to murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Many people saying that those charges really should have been separated. You should have had corruption in a separate trial to the murder charges, and maybe that would have made it easier. Some rights organizations have been complaining about the fact that they didn't get access inside of the courtroom in order to be able to document what happened. So of course a lot of questions will be raised, and they have been raised throughout the course of the 10 months of this trial as to the, the legality. And there was always this concern that the end verdict would be one that was more political than based on legal merit.
Shireen Tadros for us just outside the police academy, which was used as the courtroom. These are scenes from outside of the police academy. They're live pictures from the outskirts of Cairo, and as you can see, there's very tight security there. We can now go to Tahrir Square, where it all began. That's where the revolution started, what sparked the eventual downfall of Hosni Mubarak. People were out in Tahrir Square. They had their grievances against Hosni Mubarak's 30-year rule of corruption and brutality, and none of that was addressed in the courtroom today. Mike Hanna, what do you believe, or what kind of justice was served at all?
Well, many of those who are beginning to gather here in Tahrir Square greeted with jubilation the fact that Hosni Mubarak and his interior minister had been sentenced to life. But when they became aware that this was the extent of the judicial decision, a degree of anger has been brewing. Small crowds are beginning to march around the square, chanting invalid, invalid, with reference to the judgment. Certainly as the day goes on and the full news of the judgment about its lack of decision on certain aspects begins to spread, then there may well be ongoing protests through the course of the day.
Now, Mike, as you're speaking there, we're also seeing live pictures from outside the police academy where that verdict was handed down. The verdict now complicates the whole political process. There's going to be a runoff election very soon, and one of the candidates in that is the former Prime Minister of Hosni Mubarak. How do you think this is going to play out?
Well, it may well have a massive impact on that presidential runoff election. That is between Ahmed Shafiq, the last Prime Minister of Hosni Mubarak, and also a former minister for a long period of time within his cabinet. He's standing against Mohammed Mursi, the favoured candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that was outlawed for many years throughout the Mubarak rule. Now, that election due to take place later on in this month may certainly be affected by what has happened here. Shafiq, seen by many Egyptians as having a very close relationship to the former regime. Some go as far as to say it is a sign that the residue of that former regime remains embedded in Egyptian political life. So there may be a kickback to this judgment in terms of its effect on Shafiq. There again, it could have an opposite effect. As we saw outside the courtroom there, groups of those supporting Hosni Mubarak still gathering. Ahmed Shafiq may well attract some of that vote, an anger vote resulting out of the life sentence given to Hosni Mubarak. But to return to that sentence and the judge's deliberations, another very important point that people are picking up on, among the charges being faced by Hosni Mubarak was complicity and corruption in a gas deal signed with Israel. The judge did not rule on that in any form. This is just another example of how the immediate was partially addressed in terms of the fact that Hosni Mubarak was found guilty of not doing anything. He was not found directly complicit in the killings of those hundreds of protesters. But equally, there's no reference whatsoever to the corruption charges, the corruption allegations that have been weighed against Hosni Mubarak and those close to him for decades of rule. Here you've got one specific example, a gas deal with Israel that many regarded as corrupt, which is now the subject of international litigation, not addressed by the judge during these proceedings at all.
That's right, Mike. I want to talk more about the monetary aspects that came into this case, where all of that was shoved aside with Mubarak's sons being acquitted and another businessman being acquitted. And as you mentioned there, this whole other case with the gas sale to Israel also being thrown out and not even really addressed. Why do you think that there was so little focus on anything to do with corruption?
Well, the judge made clear in his judgment that the case of those corruption charges relating in particular to the sale and maintenance of villas and golf courses in Sharm el-Sheikh were invalid because of the statute of limitations. They, the judge said, had taken place too long ago and were outside the ambit of the court. Therefore, those specific charges in which the Mubarak sons were also implicit were dropped by the judge. He said he would not address them. Questions, of course, about why it took so long after days and hundreds of hours of court proceedings to come to this particular decision about a statute of limitations. But that issue remains. The two sons now, Ala and Gamal, have effectively been set free from these proceedings. They are facing other charges, which coincidentally enough emerged in the last 48 hours, which has to do with insider trading. There are the skeptics who would argue that these charges were brought very hurriedly with the fear that they may be released on the charges in the wider Mubarak trial. The two sons are now facing these particular charges, which have to do with affairs on Egypt's stock exchange. We do not know at this particular stage whether they will continue to be remanded in custody while that case comes up, or whether they are going to be set free along with the others who were found not guilty on the charges in this particular trial until that insider trading case comes up. But a very, very murky sequence of events here. And above all, as far as many in the Egyptian public are concerned, and as far as those beginning to chant in the square behind me here, the judge has just left too many questions open, questions that those who'd fought months of revolution were determined to hear an answer to. They didn't get it.
Mike, as you're speaking there outside of the courtroom, there are riot police bringing back deja vu to what happened in Tahrir Square way back when this whole revolution started. Give us explain to us the significance of Tahrir Square. And actually, Mike, before you do that, I just want to tell our viewer what they're looking at. This is outside of the police academy where the verdict was handed down, giving Hosni Mubarak a life sentence. You're seeing a whole line of tanks, riot police. The scene seems relatively quiet at the moment, but numerous scuffles have broken out since that verdict was handed down just over an hour ago. As it seems that security is very tight, and our correspondents have been emphasizing how much security has been on the ground, almost unprecedented amount of security. So people or the government is expecting a strong reaction of some sort and trying to preempt it. In fact, we can now go to some pictures just a few moments ago of some of those scuffles. People facing up against the riot police, the police being able to push them back. They haven't been able to break through police lines. But going back to Tahrir Square, way back when this all started, Mike, Hannah, it wasn't like that at all. There was such a sense of disorganization on the side of the police, which eventually led to this courtroom trial. Can you give us a sense of history, a sense of context of the importance of Tahrir Square and the events there?
Well, it was on the 25th of January last year that after incidents in the surrounds, the people began to gather in the square. That provided the fulcrum that led to the revolution that a few weeks later led to Hosni Mubarak standing down. Importantly, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, the military taking over, a role that they still execute in Egypt. They hold executive power, the executive powers that Hosni Mubarak had. But the importance of Tahrir Square and those who gathered here was not limited to that particular period. Throughout the months that have followed, each time there has been what people have perceived as a hiccup in the revolution, a pause in the revolution, or attempts of counter-revolution, the people have once again gathered in the square, hundreds of thousands of them. It has become a symbol not just of the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, but also a guardian of the revolution, a guardian of the hopes and dreams that those had when that man fell down after 3 decades in power. Now, throughout this period of time as well, you have had crowds gathered here to protest against actions by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. You've had crowds gathered here to protest against actions by those that they see as remnants of the old regime. Now, what we will see, perhaps in the hours to come, is once again people beginning to gather here in reaction against a court case that they believe, many of them believe, did not address the full issues that Egypt wanted an answer to. And these issues predominantly had to do with who, in the end, was directly responsible for the deaths of more than 700 people during the process of that revolution. That is the one fundamental question that many have. The next fundamental question that many had is, why is nobody being held to account for those years of corruption, those years of oppression that happened during the Mubarak regime? So these are the two questions that are likely to be asked in the days ahead. And out of that, a third question: what role has the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, the military, played in all of this? Many in the crowds who will be gathering behind here likely to ask that question. Is the military going to guard the revolution as it says it does, as it has pledged it will? Or is it the people here in Tahrir Square, the symbol of the revolutionary forces around the country, who will continue to be guardians of that revolution, a revolution the success of which is now once again being called into question because of a very controversial verdict by a judge in a Cairo court?
That's Mike Hanna live for us in Tahrir Square, where it all began. But those protests then spread to Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, very much a place where there was a lot of anti-Mubarak sentiment. Jamal El-Shayal is there for us. Jamal, so what kind of reaction has there been? As you mentioned earlier, this was one of those areas which has been historically anti-Mubarak.
Indeed, Divya, people have started to come out, albeit in small numbers. Just outside the mosque behind me down the road, a small but very loud crowd is gathering with the Egyptian flags, with the same slogans as are being chanted in Tahrir and I'm sure in several other places across the country, putting not only into question the verdict handed down by the judge, but also essentially dismissing it as a corrupt verdict, as a false verdict that they do not recognize, something that has fallen way short of the expectations and indeed the demands of the people who have been coming out week in, week out throughout the past year and a half, calling for a complete change in the country, a cleansing of the system, as they call it, tathir, not only in the system but also in the judiciary and the media, which they really do feel has played a negative role in the process and the progression of this revolution. Obviously, it's only last week that the people of Alexandria took to the ballot boxes to vote. They're expected to do the same as the rest of their countrymen in the next couple of weeks, and this is there's no doubt that today's verdict will play a significant role in deciding the future of that election, Divya.
Now, there was much sentiment against Mubarak because of what happened during his tenure as presidency, all the corruption, all the other brutality, all kinds of other grievances which were never addressed in this case. And Alexandria has been one city that obviously has been watching this very closely. What do you think is going to be if there is going to be any kind of recourse there?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, to give some context of the specific situation or position of Alexandrians and Alexandria, if you look at the history of Alexandria, Alexandria was once one of the prides not only of Egypt as a city, but also the Arab world. Songs were sung about it as the princess of the Mediterranean, a massive tourist attraction. And during Mubarak's governance, the city just kept going down in terms of unemployment increasing, tourism going down, infrastructure practically not visible. The trams that you might hear the sound of behind me, the same tram that was being used 30, 40 years ago. And it's those charges that a lot of people want to put towards Mubarak, is that yes, they consider that this person was guilty of killing people, guilty of oppressing people during the revolution. But above that, the guilt of running the country and running the city into the ground through corruption that they believe he was instrumental behind, and through the oppression of those who wanted to progress and change the city. In terms of how this is going to reflect in the ballot box, well, it's very simple. Already the indications from the first round was that Ahmed Shafiq, a close ally of the Mubarak regime, who once described Hosni Mubarak as his role model, in fact, and said that he actually derives a lot of his examples from the former president. He already came 5th place in that election first round a few weeks ago. It's likely that he will find little voices of support here because the city already has a strong, as you mentioned, anti-Mubarak history to it. More importantly, though, is how they're going to react in terms of why Ahmed Shafiq was not also found guilty, even though charges were never leveled against him. They considered the idea that, well, if Mubarak is guilty, because he was in government, ran the government, and failed to prevent the killing of these people. Well, the Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq, at the time, was also responsible, and therefore he should also be accused and charged with the same thing, because it was in his powers. In the end of the day, the ministers like Habib al-Adli, the Interior Minister, although ultimately they report to the President, their first point of call, their first boss, if you will, is the Prime Minister, and therefore some responsibility must be put on him. And this is a lot of what is being said here, particularly as the two people who came out first in the first round of the elections here in Alexandria, Abdelmenam Abul Futuh and Hamdin Sabahi, have both been calling, they are the former candidates who failed to make it, have both been calling for the trial of not only Mubarak and his aides, as we've seen today, but also of people like Shafiq, and in fact members of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, who once again, as Mike pointed out, will be looked upon with not only doubt but cynicism and anger by a lot of people who feel that this decision it's by no coincidence that the verdict was placed in the middle of this election in order to maybe throw the revolution into some sort of chaos. So a lot of anger in the coming hours will be decisive in showing how things will progress in the coming days.
Our correspondent Jamal El-Shael in Alexandria, a city that played a big part in the revolution against Hosni Mubarak. Okay, you're watching Al Jazeera's extended coverage of the trial of Hosni Mubarak. The former Egyptian president has been sentenced to life in prison for his role in killing of hundreds of protesters during the revolution that toppled him last year. But he was acquitted on charges of corruption along with his two sons. The former Interior Minister Habib al-Adli was also given a life sentence for ordering security forces to open fire on protesters. 6 of his aides were also on trial. They were acquitted on all charges, including corruption and conspiring to kill protesters. Here's the decision as it was handed down by the judge, Ahmed Refat.
The court hereby orders and adjudges in presentia against all the defendants, save the second defendant, against whom the judgment is in absentia. First, the defendant, Muhammad Hosni Mubarak, be sentenced to a life term for the accusation ascribed to him, being accessory to the murder, accompanied by attempt murder as ascribed to him in the bill of indictment. Second, the defendants, Habib al-Adli, be sentenced to a life term for the accusation brought against him, being accessory to murder with attempt murder as per the bill of indictment. Third, the judgment debtors named above be ordered to pay the court proceedings expenses and costs. All the seized exhibits be withheld. Fifth, the following defendants be exonerated: Ahmed Muhammad Ramzi Abdul Rashid, Adli Mustafa Abdul Rahman Faid, Hassan Muhammad Abdul Rahman Yusuf, Ismail Muhammad Abdul Jawad Al Sha'ir, Usama Yusuf Ismail Marasi, and Omar Abdul Aziz Faramawi Afifi be all exonerated and acquitted from the accusations stated in the bill of indictment. Sixth, the penal case against Muhammad Hosni Mubarak, Hussein Kamal al-Din Ibrahim Salim, Ala Hosni Mubarak, and Gamal Hosni Mubarak be lapsed for the accusation of abuse of power and acceptance of grant. The case be lapsed for being time-barred.
Okay, we can now go live to Shireen Tadros, who's standing by for us outside of the courthouse. Firstly, Shireen, I want you to set the scene for us there. There were scuffles earlier amid very tight security. What's happening there now?
things a little calmer, perhaps because of the news that we just had confirmed to us now, which is that Hosni Mubarak, the former president who's just been sentenced to a life sentence here at the police academy, has actually now been moved to Tora Prison Hospital. He was in a military hospital just on the outskirts of Cairo. It was very controversial, the fact he was there. There were big questions as to whether he would remain there in the state-of-the-art facility or be moved. He now has been moved and he will serve his sentence there. We're also hearing rumors of appeals. That's something that we were completely expecting, of course, that both the prosecution, in fact, and the defense would appeal the various verdicts that were handed down. And we're also told that the aides of Habib al-Adli, the 6 senior aides from the Interior Ministry that were acquitted, will actually need to be checked first, but then will be allowed to go free. Ala and Gamal Mubarak, the sons of Hosni Mubarak, who were acquitted, still have a case pending, and the latest information we have is that they will remain in custody until that trial concludes.
Shireen Tadros live for us in Cairo. Shireen, as we were saying, that there were many issues with the way the trial was carried out, with the fact that evidence wasn't read out. There were all kinds of allegations in the fact that they didn't hear certain testimonies from witnesses saying that they were lying. What are the concerns about how this whole process was carried out?
Yes, I mean, there was an overarching concern from the start that there was a lot of pressure being put on the judges to make a certain kind of decision, so that decision may end up being more political than based on legal merits. And the prosecution themselves said that they had huge problems during the course of the trial, and even before the trial began, in fact, in getting the necessary witnesses and documents that they needed from the various ministries, and especially from the intelligence services. They said they were not very cooperative. Once the trial began, there were various disruptions, including a long break where some of the lawyers that belonged to the who represented the families of those who were killed asked for the judges to step down, and there was a lot of weeks, in fact, when the case actually just stopped, and many people were raising questions as to its legitimacy. Other problems too to do with the fact that there were so many different charges leveled at Hosni Mubarak and Habib al-Adli and these aides, the sons, and also, of course, a business tycoon, Hussein Salim, who was being tried in absentia. And so when he came back, the trial would have to start for him all over again. So there was so much complications surrounding this trial. Add to that the limited access, the fact that cameras were barred from broadcasting the trial live after the first 2 sessions. There was a gag order placed on the testimonies of some of the senior officials like Omar Suleiman, the former intelligence chief, and the Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, who gave their testimonies during the course of the trial, but reporters were not allowed to say what was actually said. And also rights organizations said that they had very limited access to the proceedings of the trial and weren't being allowed in. So various holes and questions of legitimacy surrounding this trial. And now that there's a verdict out, we still really have to look through the written statement by Judge Ahmed Rifat to find out exactly his reasoning behind handing down the sentences that he did.
Now, Shireen, all this takes place against a backdrop of a political process that was instigated by the protests that led to this case. And amongst that, in that political process, there's going to be a runoff election between which involves Ahmed Shafiq, who was Hosni Mubarak's former prime minister. So the question now is, given this verdict and given the fact that many people seem to be dissatisfied by the verdict, does it look like the Muslim Brotherhood and the opposition would unite, and it puts Shafiq in a rather pessimistic position?
There is definitely a feeling that this verdict, although we're seeing Hosni Mubarak serve a life sentence, may very well work in the favor of the Muslim Brotherhood's candidate Mohammed Morsi, because it feeds into this idea that there's been no accountability, and until there is a change in the regime, not just accountability at the top levels but in all different levels, then nothing really will have changed in the country. There's also a lot of skepticism surrounding this actual verdict of a life sentence sentence being handed down, and the fact that the incoming president may well have the power to make sure that that verdict is never carried out and in fact free Habib al-Adli and the former president Hosni Mubarak. So of course people talking about how Ahmed Shafiq, because he was so close to Mubarak, we heard our correspondent there in Alexandria, Gamal al-Shayal, talk to us about how Ahmed Shafiq in fact called Mubarak at one point his role model. So there's no there are no questions over the closeness of Mubarak and Ahmed Shafiq. The fact that he was the last man appointed as Prime Minister under Mubarak before he stepped down, there's no questions as to the closeness, and people are asking whether, if there was an Ahmed Shafiq presidency, whether the limited happiness, euphoria that has come out of today, the fact that Hosni Mubarak will be held accountable and serve a life sentence, will actually just dissipate under an Ahmed Shafiq presidency.
Now, Shireen Tadros, as you're speaking there, we're seeing live pictures from outside of the courthouse just on the outskirts of Cairo. It was held at the police academy where the verdict was handed down. A life sentence for Hosni Mubarak, a life sentence for Adli, the former interior minister. Mubarak's sons, 2 sons, acquitted on corruption charges. Also acquitted were the other ministers and aides that were accused of not protecting property during those protests. But the one thing I want to highlight in all of this is the fact that it seems that anything to do with money and corruption has been sidelined, as we've seen with the acquittals. Is there a sense that it has something to do with the current status of the government, the fact that so many former remnants of Mubarak's regime still are in place?
I mean, this is a big question mark, because coming into the days before, coming into this verdict, people were saying that it's a lot easier to find these defendants guilty on financial corruption charges than on murder charges. And in fact, there have been other members of the former regime that have been given sentences based on financial corruption. If you look at the actual judgment handed down by Ahmed Rifat, he described his reasoning for acquitting Gamal and Ala Mubarak for these financial corruption charges on the basis that at the time which we're talking about, where these villas were exchanged and these bribes were happening, this was more than 10 years ago, and so under the statute of limitations, they can't actually hand a verdict down, or they can't even hear the case because of the time frame and the fact that it's been such a long time since all these bribes happened. And I think what it does again is raise a lot of questions as to how these charges were brought about and whether these were the right charges to be leveled at these various people. The fact is that the time which people are talking about the killing of protesters is in a very very narrow time frame, just the 10 days or so in January, and a lot of people are saying that they would rather have seen wider charges being leveled.